This isn't the goodbye where you cry or collapse or beg to be understood. This is the goodbye where they lose power forever. Avoidants expect distance to weaken you. They expect silence to make you chase, to explain yourself again, to fight for clarity they never intended to give. Their entire attachment strategy is built on one assumption, that emotional withdrawal will activate your fear of loss. But this goodbye does something completely different. It doesn't beg, it doesn't explain, it doesn't demand closure. It closes the emotional door quietly, and that is what destabilizes them at a nervous system level. Because for the first time, the silence isn't punishment or protest. It's peace. Avoidants are prepared for drama. They are prepared for tears, anger, long messages, and emotional reactions. Those responses confirm their sense of control and reinforce the dynamic where they hold the power by staying distant. What they are not prepared for is emotional neutrality. When you stop chasing understanding, when you stop asking them to meet you halfway, when you stop reacting to their withdrawal, their internal framework collapses. The goodbye that breaks their control is not loud or dramatic. It is regulated, grounded, and final. And that finality is what their psyche cannot easily process. This goodbye sends a message without words. It says, I see the pattern and I am no longer participating. That realization hits avoidance differently, because their identity is often tied to being needed without being fully available. They expect you to stay emotionally attached even after they pull away. They expect access without responsibility. But when you remove emotional access completely, you interrupt the loop they rely on to feel safe and superior at the same time. What destabilizes them is not losing you physically. It's losing the emotional tether. It's realizing that distance no longer gives them leverage. In their mind, pulling away was supposed to make you come close. When it doesn't, their nervous system experiences confusion, loss of control, and delayed emotional impact. That's why this goodbye lingers. It doesn't trigger immediate reaction. It triggers reflection, and reflection is where avoidants feel the most uncomfortable. This is the goodbye they are not wired to recover from, because it removes the role they assigned you in the dynamic. You were supposed to stay available. You were supposed to keep hoping. You were supposed to wait. But instead, you chose emotional self-respect. And once that door closes quietly, it doesn't reopen for explanations, apologies, or delayed realizations. That's the moment the power shifts permanently. Avoidants don't fear losing people. They fear losing access. That distinction explains almost everything about their behavior in relationships. They are comfortable with distance because distance feels safe. They are skilled at emotional withdrawal because it gives them a sense of control over intimacy. Deep down, they assume that no matter how far they pull away, you will remain emotionally available in the background. Available to respond, available to care, available to wait. Even when they are inconsistent, dismissive, or cold, they believe the bond remains intact as long as you are still emotionally tethered to them. Loss, in their mind, is temporary. Access feels permanent. This is why avoidants can walk away so easily in the moment. They don't experience separation the way securely attached people do. When they create distance, their nervous system actually calms down. The absence of emotional demand feels like relief. They tell themselves they are independent, self-sufficient, and unaffected. But this sense of calm is built on a false assumption that you are still there emotionally, that you are still reachable, that if they return, the door will still be open. As long as access exists, they don't register the situation as loss. Everything changes when that access disappears. The moment an avoidant senses emotional detachment instead of pain, something shifts internally. Pain is familiar to them. Pain signals that the bond still exists. Pain means you are still invested. Pain reassures them that they matter. But emotional detachment is different. Detachment doesn't argue. It doesn't explain. It doesn't protest. It doesn't seek repair. It simply withdraws its energy. and their nervous system does not know how to interpret that. For the first time, distance doesn't soothe them, it threatens them. Their body registers emotional detachment as abandonment, even if they were the ones who pulled away first. This is the paradox of avoidant attachment. They can initiate distance, but they struggle when distance becomes permanent. Temporary separation feels control. Permanent emotional absence feels destabilizing. It signals a loss they cannot reverse. And because avoidants are wired to suppress emotional processing in the moment, the impact is delayed. It doesn't hit right away. It arrives later, quietly, when there is no one left to respond to. This is when they begin to feel something they are not practiced at managing: lack of access. No emotional mirror, no reassurance, no familiar response pattern. They replay interactions. They wonder why you didn't fight. They question why you didn't react the way others did. The absence of your emotional availability becomes louder than any argument ever was, and that is when loss becomes real to them. This delayed realization is why avoidants often appear unaffected at first and then struggle much later. Their attachment system is designed to numb, not process. But once permanence sets in, once the nervous system accepts that the door is actually closed, the emotional weight surfaces, not as open grief, but as confusion, regret, and internal unrest. They don't fear loss in the beginning because they don't believe it's real. They fear it only when it can no longer be undone. They didn't pull away because they don't care. They pulled away because caring feels unsafe. Avoidant distancing is often misunderstood as indifference or emotional strength. In reality, it is protection. It is a learned survival response, rooted in early experiences where closeness felt overwhelming, unreliable, or conditional. Vulnerability for them is associated with loss of control. So they create space not because they lack feeling, but because feeling threatens their internal stability. Inside many avoidant patterns is a subtle narcissistic wound. This doesn't mean they are narcissists in the clinical sense. It means their sense of self is protected by emotional distance. Being needed without being fully known gives them a feeling of superiority and safety at the same time. They maintain control by staying one step removed. As long as they are the less invested one, they feel secure. As long as they can withdraw and still be wanted, their self-image remains intact. When you leave without reaction, you expose the wound beneath that armor. No rage, no pleading, no long explanations, just absence. And that absence is deeply confronting. It removes the mirror they use to regulate their sense of importance. It removes the proof that they are desired without effort. It removes the illusion that they can disengage without consequence. This is why calm detachment hits harder than emotional confrontation. Anger still communicates investment. Tears still communicate attachment. Explanations still communicate hope. But silence combined with emotional withdrawal communicates something else entirely: acceptance. And acceptance, to an avoidant with a narcissistic wound, feels like rejection. It signals that they are no longer central, no longer needed, no longer in control of the emotional dynamic. That experience creates what psychology refers to as narcissistic injury. Not because you attacked them, but because you stopped validating the role they relied on to feel secure. You didn't argue for your place in their life. You didn't try to prove your worth. You simply removed yourself from the dynamic, and that removal forces them to face something they have avoided their entire lives: the consequences of emotional unavailability. This injury doesn't always look dramatic. It often looks like delayed regret, intrusive thoughts, or an urge to re-establish contact under the guise of curiosity or concern. They may not fully understand what they are feeling, only that something feels unresolved. That unresolved feeling comes from the wound you exposed by leaving without reaction. You didn't collapse, you didn't chase, you didn't punish. You simply chose yourself, and that choice disrupts the entire avoidant narcissistic framework. Because the power they believed they had was never about distance. It was about access. Once access is gone, the armor no longer protects them. It reveals the vulnerability they worked so hard to hide. When you stop trying to be understood, they start trying to understand you. This is the hidden trigger that avoids never see coming. Avoidants are used to having the upper hand in relationships because they control the emotional distance. They control the pace. They control the level of intimacy. When you respond with desperation, they feel relief. When you chase for answers, they feel safe. But when you stop defending yourself, stop explaining your feelings, stop begging for clarity, and stop chasing closure, you remove the familiar script they rely on. That's when the real shift happens. This goodbye isn't loud. It doesn't explode into arguments or dramatic confrontations. It's regulated, calm, unemotional. It's the kind of goodbye that looks like you've simply moved on, not because you don't care, but because you finally realized your worth. And that calm silence forces them to sit with something avoidants hate most: unresolved emotion. They are experts at avoiding emotional discomfort, but they are not prepared for the discomfort of not knowing what happened or why you didn't fight. They are not prepared for the silence that doesn't beg for attention. That silence does not give them permission to stay distant anymore. The avoidance strategy works because it keeps them emotionally unexposed. But when you stop reacting, you expose them in a way they can't control. They can no longer hide behind the excuse that you're the one who keeps pushing. The dynamic breaks because you refuse to participate. You are no longer the emotional battery that keeps them functioning. Without your reactions, they have to face the emptiness they created. And emptiness is not something avoidants handle well. So instead of chasing you, they begin to obsess. Not in a healthy way, not in a "I want to understand you better" way, but in a fearful internal way. Their mind starts replaying every moment. They begin to question why you left without explanation. They start imagining scenarios where you did fight. They start wondering if they could have prevented it. The obsession isn't about love. It's about the fear of loss, the fear of being alone with their own emotions. And that fear grows because they have no access to you anymore. This is why avoidants often come back after you've moved on. Not because they suddenly realized your value, but because the structure that kept them safe is gone. Their emotional system is trying to repair the damage by seeking the familiar, even if it's toxic. They are not seeking you, they are seeking the return of control. They are seeking the reassurance that the dynamic can still be restored. And that's when you realize the goodbye wasn't a punishment, it was a boundary. It was a reset. It was the moment you finally stopped being the emotional anchor that held them in place. Avoidants forget pain, but they never forget presence. This is one of the most important truths about avoidant attachment. They are skilled at moving on from emotional hurt because they distance themselves from it. They don't sit with it, they don't process it, and they don't let it define them. But presence is different. Presence is a memory of being seen, being held, being understood, and being emotionally engaged. Presence is something avoidants don't know how to create without feeling vulnerable. So when you were there, they didn't fully value it. They took it for granted, and when you're gone, the presence becomes the void that haunts them. Once you're no longer emotionally available, their mind fills the gap. The absence becomes a loud, constant noise in their head. They replay moments like a broken record. They imagine conversations that never happened. They reconstruct the relationship in their mind, trying to find the missing piece. They wonder why you didn't fight. They wonder why you didn't ask for them. They wonder why you didn't call them out. Their mind becomes obsessed with the what-ifs, because those what-ifs are easier to manage than the truth that you left because you stopped tolerating emotional neglect. Your absence becomes louder than any argument ever was. When you were there, they could avoid the real emotional work. They could stay distant while you carried the weight of the relationship. But when you leave, the weight shifts. It lands on them, and they don't know what to do with it. They begin to replay every moment you were close, every time you showed love, every time you tried to communicate. They try to understand what changed. They try to understand why you didn't stay. This replaying is not a sign of growth. It is a sign of discomfort. It is a sign that their attachment system is finally recognizing what it has been avoiding. And because they don't know how to cope with it, they do what they always do. They retreat, then they return, then they retreat again. They become inconsistent, because consistency requires emotional investment, and emotional investment requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is the thing they fear most. So yes, avoidants forget pain, but they never forget presence. And that is why the goodbye they never recover from is not the one filled with drama. It's the one filled with silence. It's the one where you stop trying to be understood and instead choose to be free. Because once you are free, they realize they never truly had you. And that realization is something avoidants struggle to live with. They expected you to stay bonded to the chaos. That is the entire foundation of a trauma bond. It doesn't exist because the relationship is healthy or balanced. It exists because the emotional highs and lows create a powerful, addictive loop. The chaos becomes the glue, and the pain becomes proof that the connection is real. Avoidants are often attracted to this dynamic because it allows them to stay emotionally distant while still feeling significant. They can leave, return, withdraw, and re-enter without ever having to fully face what they feel. And as long as you react, as long as you chase, as long as you plead, the bond remains intact. Trauma bonds thrive on emotional reactions. They feed on the energy you give them. When you are desperate for answers, when you are begging for clarity, when you are fighting to keep them, the bond grows stronger. It is not love, it is survival instinct. It is the brain trying to create meaning out of instability. But when you heal, when you stop reacting, when you stop being the emotional fuel, the bond starts to crack. Your healing breaks the pattern, because the pattern depends on your participation. It depends on your willingness to remain in the cycle. It depends on your belief that the relationship will eventually stabilize if you just try hard. When you walk away with self-respect instead of desperation, the bond snaps, not for you, but for them. This is the moment avoidants feel the most threatened. They don't fear losing you because they don't think they need you. They fear losing you because you were the one who validated their ability to avoid emotional closeness without consequences. Your presence gave them permission to remain distant because you kept showing up anyway. But when you leave, you remove that permission. You remove the safety net. You remove the emotional cushion that allowed them to avoid real intimacy. That break feels like a loss of identity for them. They were used to being in control, used to being the one who could leave without consequence. They were used to being the one who could remain emotionally unavailable and still be desired. But now, without the trauma bond, they are forced to face the truth. They don't know how to have a relationship without distance. They don't know how to show up fully, and the part of their identity that relied on being unreachable begins to crumble. This is why avoidants react strangely after you leave. They may seem confused, they may seem lost, they may act like they don't care. But inside, the absence of your emotional energy is creating a vacuum they don't know how to fill. They begin to question themselves. They begin to wonder why they are not feeling the relief they expected. They begin to feel the discomfort of being alone with their own emotions. And that discomfort is terrifying because they have spent their whole life avoiding it. You didn't abandon them. You outgrew the dynamic. This is the key truth that avoidants struggle to accept because it challenges their entire emotional strategy. They are not used to being outgrown. They are used to being replaced. They are used to being ignored. They are used to being forgiven, but they are not used to being seen clearly and then left with dignity. When you leave without begging, without chasing, without making yourself smaller, you send a message that is impossible for them to ignore. You are no longer willing to be trapped in the cycle. Avoidants don't recover from this goodbye because it exposes the truth. They didn't lose you because of conflict. They didn't lose you because you were too much or too sensitive. They lost you because they refused to meet you emotionally. They refused to show up when it mattered. They refused to prioritize your needs, and the worst part for them is that this realization arrives too late. It arrives after the bond is broken, after the distance becomes permanent, after the emotional door is closed. They are left with the memory of someone who was willing to love them deeply and the inability to reciprocate that love in a meaningful way. That combination creates a sense of regret that is not easily processed. Avoidants don't know how to deal with regret because regret requires vulnerability, regret requires ownership, regret requires emotional presence, and those are the exact things they avoided in the first place. So the goodbye changes them, not you. You walk away with clarity. You walk away with peace. You walk away with self-respect. You are free from the chaos. They are left with the realization that the person they took for granted is gone. And that realization is the kind of loss avoidants are not equipped to recover from. The moment you stop seeking validation, you become unforgettable. This is the truth that avoidants never anticipate because they assume that emotional withdrawal will always keep them in control. They believe that as long as they stay distant, they will remain the one who decides when the connection continues or ends. But when you stop chasing their approval, stop begging for their attention, and stop trying to earn their love, you shift the entire dynamic. You move from being a source of emotional fuel to being a person with boundaries, dignity, and self-respect. That shift is not dramatic on the surface, but it is seismic beneath it. It removes the power they held over you, and it replaces it with something they can't control: your peace. You didn't punish them. You didn't manipulate them. You didn't try to make them feel guilty or prove a point. You simply chose peace over potential, and that choice is more powerful than any argument or confrontation, because avoidants are used to emotional chaos. Chaos keeps them safe, because it allows them to remain detached while still feeling significant. But peace is unfamiliar to them. Peace means you are no longer available to be used as a comfort object or a backup plan. Peace means you have decided to stop participating in the emotional game they have been playing, and that decision changes everything. This is the goodbye that rewires the relationship. It doesn't just end it, it changes the meaning of it. It takes away the false sense of security they had, the belief that they could always return to you, that you would always be there, that you would always take them back. Once you stop seeking validation, you stop giving them that safety net. You stop offering them the emotional guarantee they relied on. And without that guarantee, they are forced to confront the reality of their own emotional limitations. This is why they never recover from this kind of goodbye. Not because they don't care, but because they realize too late that the person they took for granted was never someone they could replace easily. Your peace becomes a mirror they can't look away from. It shows them what they missed and what they were never willing to fight for. It makes them question the choices they made. It forces them to recognize the depth of your presence and the reality of your absence. And that is the power shift they never anticipated. Because you didn't fight to stay. You simply stopped fighting for them. This goodbye wasn't meant to wake them up. It was meant to wake you up. And that is the real power of it. You didn't lose someone who couldn't love you fully. You released a pattern that was slowly draining your soul. You stopped investing in a relationship that only thrived on distance, inconsistency, and emotional avoidance. You chose yourself over the illusion of being needed. You chose peace over the endless cycle of chasing. That is why they never recover. Not because you were cruel, not because you were cold, but because you finally became unavailable in the way they never expected. You stopped being their emotional safety net, and you stopped giving them the permission to remain distant. You didn't punish them, you simply stopped participating. And in doing so, you exposed the truth they were never willing to face. That you were not the problem. Their emotional unavailability, because the version of you who needed them never came back. The version of you who begged, who explained, who pleaded for clarity, who stayed despite being hurt, That person is gone. In her place is someone who understands their worth, someone who knows what love feels like, and someone who refuses to settle for anything less. This goodbye wasn't the end of your story. It was the beginning of your freedom. And the more you heal, the more you realize that leaving wasn't a loss. It was the moment you finally chose yourself.